The crack of flesh against flesh echoed through the ceremonial hall as Lady Marcella's hand connected with the face of Livia, the lowly Omega servant who had dared to stumble near the wedding altar. Blood trickled from Livia's split lip as she crumpled to the marble floor, her worn servant's dress pooling around her like a puddle of shame. The 500 guests gasped in unison, their silk garments rustling like a murder of startled crows. But it was the sudden silence that followed that made every spine in that room turn to ice, because King Augustus himself had risen from his throne, his face carved from stone and fury, his eyes locked not on his bride, but on the trembling Omega bleeding at her feet. If you want to know what happens when destiny shatters every rule you thought you knew, then stay with me until the very end of this story, because what I'm about to tell you will change everything you believe about power, fate, and the bonds that can never be broken. And before we dive deeper, tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug, because you're going to need it for this emotional journey. The ceremony had begun just minutes earlier with all the grandeur the Crimson Moon Kingdom could muster. King Augustus stood at the altar, a mountain of a man with shoulders that could carry the weight of nations. His dark hair swept back from a face that had launched 1,000 tributes and twice as many wars. At 32, he was the most powerful alpha in the known territories, a king who had unified 7 warring packs under one banner through strength, strategy, and an iron will that bent for no one. His ceremonial armor caught the light from 1,000 candles, making him appear as though he were forged from starlight and steel. Beside him stood Lady Marcella of House Aurelius, the bride chosen by the Council of Elders, selected for her impeccable bloodline, her connections to the northern territories, and her undeniable beauty. She was everything a Luna queen should be on paper, educated in 7 languages, trained in diplomacy and warfare, descended from a line of alphas that stretched back 3 centuries. Her wedding gown had taken 40 seamstresses 6 months to complete, encrusted with pearls harvested from the midnight sea and diamonds that had once adorned empresses. Her golden hair was arranged in elaborate braids that must have taken hours to perfect, each strand a testament to her status and preparation for this moment. The high priest Cornelius had just begun the sacred bonding rites, his ancient voice carrying through the vaulted hall as he recited words that had joined alpha pairs for generations. The smoke from the ceremonial incense curled upward, carrying prayers to the moon goddess herself, asking for her blessing on this union that would secure political alliances and strengthen the kingdom's borders. Every detail had been planned for months. The seating arrangements alone had caused 3 diplomatic incidents, and the menu had been debated by committees. This was not merely a wedding but a statement of power, a declaration that the Crimson Moon Kingdom stood unshakable. But the moon goddess, it seemed, had other plans. Livia had been assigned to the ceremonial preparations, one of dozens of lowly Omegas tasked with ensuring everything ran perfectly. At 19, she had spent her entire life in the shadows of the palace, orphaned as an infant and raised in the servant quarters where Omega children were taught that their purpose was to serve, to remain invisible, to never dare to dream beyond their station. She had scrubbed floors that she would never walk across as a guest, polished silver she would never eat from, and arranged flowers she would never receive. Her life was measured in chores completed, in how silently she could move through corridors, in how thoroughly she could disappear when nobility passed by. She had thick auburn hair that she kept hidden beneath a servant's cap, gray eyes that she kept downcast, and a slender frame that spoke of meals often skipped so that higher-ranking wolves could eat their fill. The other servants pitied her, the Omegas especially, because Livia bore the additional burden of being wolfless. At 19, her wolf had never emerged, marking her as defective even among the lowest rank. Some whispered she was cursed, others that she had been born under an ill-favored moon, but most simply forgot she existed at all, which was exactly how Livia had survived this long. On this day, her task had been simple: ensure the ceremonial wine goblets remained filled, stand ready with spare candles should any of the 1,000 flames gutter, and above all, remain invisible. She had repeated these instructions to herself like a prayer as she stood in her designated spot behind a marble column, her hands clasped before her, her breathing shallow and controlled. She had watched as the most powerful wolves in the kingdom filed into the hall, their combined presence making the very air feel thick and heavy with dominance. She had felt the familiar crushing weight of so many alpha and beta auras pressing down on her omega nature, making her wolf, if it even existed, cower deeper inside her soul. Then the king had entered, and everything inside Livia had simply stopped. It wasn't the sight of him, though he was magnificent to behold. It wasn't the power that radiated from him like heat from a forge, though it made every wolf in the room bow their heads reflexively. It was something else, something that defied explanation, a pull so fundamental and terrifying that Livia's entire body began to tremble. Her heart, which had been beating steadily moments before, suddenly thundered against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. Her skin flushed hot, then cold, then hot again. Every nerve ending in her body ignited simultaneously, and for one impossible world-shattering moment, she could have sworn she felt something inside her, something that had always been dormant and silent, suddenly stir and whisper one word that made no sense, that couldn't possibly be true, that would doom her if anyone ever discovered it. It was impossible. Omegas didn't have fated mates, especially not wolfless defective Omegas who weren't even worthy of having their names remembered. And certainly absolutely not with kings. Kings mated with ladies of noble houses, with powerful she-wolves who could stand beside them and strengthen bloodlines and secure territories. The very idea was so absurd that Livia tried to convince herself she was having some kind of medical episode, perhaps a reaction to the intense incense smoke or the stress of working such an important event. But then King Augustus had paused in his processional walk to the altar, his head turning slightly as if he had heard something no one else could perceive. His nostrils flared, and even from her position behind the column, Livia saw his pupils dilate and his hands clench into fists. 4-3 heartbeats, he stood frozen, his enormous frame tense as a drawn bow, and Livia watched in horror as his eyes scanned the room with predatory precision, searching, seeking, hunting for something his alpha instincts had detected. Their eyes met across the crowded hall for precisely half a second, gray meeting dark brown, and the world tilted on its axis. Livia felt as though she had been struck by lightning, every cell in her body screaming recognition and longing and terror all at once. She saw his eyes widen fractionally, saw something like shock and confusion flicker across his usually impassive face, saw his lips part as if to speak or perhaps to call out. Then Lady Marcella had placed her hand on his arm, reclaiming his attention, and the moment shattered. The king's expression smoothed into careful neutrality as he continued to the altar, though Livia noticed, because she couldn't stop watching him, couldn't tear her eyes away even though she knew it was dangerous, that his jaw remained tight and a muscle ticked in his cheek. He did not look back at her, but she could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands remained fisted at his sides, the slight flare of his nostrils as if he were still trying to catch a scent on the air. Livia told herself to breathe, to calm down, to forget whatever insanity had just occurred. She pressed herself harder against the column, making herself as small as possible, praying to every deity she could name that the ceremony would proceed and end, and she could escape to her tiny room in the servants' quarters and try to make sense of what had just happened. Her whole body shook with the effort of remaining still, of not bolting from the room or worse, not walking toward him, because some newly awakened part of her wanted nothing more than to cross that hall and... The head servant, a stern beta woman named Kasia, had gestured sharply at Livia then, pointing to the ceremonial wine that needed to be brought forward for the blessing. It wasn't supposed to be Livia's task. She was far too low-ranking to approach the altar during the actual ceremony, but the Omega who had been assigned to it had apparently fainted from the pressure of so many dominant auras, and now Livia was being thrust into a role she was utterly unprepared for. She picked up the heavy golden tray with the 2 jeweled goblets, filled with wine that cost more than she would earn in a lifetime, and began the longest walk of her life toward the altar where King Augustus and Lady Marcella stood waiting. Every eye in the room should have been on the couple, on the high priest, on the sacred ceremony unfolding, but Livia felt exposed and visible in a way she had never experienced, as if she were walking naked through a crowd of judges. Her hands shook, making the wine in the goblets tremble and catch the candlelight. She kept her eyes fixed downward, focusing on not spilling, on not stumbling, on completing this one simple task so she could retreat back into invisibility. 20 steps to the altar, then 15, then 10. The incense smoke grew thicker, making her dizzy, Or perhaps it was the proximity to the king, whose presence seemed to fill the entire front of the hall with an energy that made her skin prickle and her barely there wolf whimper. 5 steps away, Livia made the mistake of glancing up. King Augustus was staring directly at her, his dark eyes intense and burning with something she couldn't name but that made her knees go weak. His chest rose and fell with breaths that seemed harder than they should be, and she saw his hands twitch at his sides as if he were restraining himself from reaching for something. The air between them felt charged, electric, like the moment before a lightning strike. Time seemed to slow, the voices around them fading to a distant murmur, and in that frozen moment, Livia knew with absolute certainty that he felt it too, this impossible, forbidden, world-ending pull. Then Lady Marcella noticed where her groom's attention had gone, and her beautiful face transformed into something ugly and furious. She turned to look at what could possibly be distracting the king during his own wedding ceremony, her eyes landing on Livia with the impact of a physical blow. The lady's lips curled into a sneer that revealed perfectly white teeth clenched in rage, and Livia saw the exact moment Lady Marcella decided to make an example of the lowly Omega who dared to exist in the king's line of sight. Livia tried to step back, suddenly terrified in a way that had nothing to do with dropped wine or broken protocol, and everything to do with the predatory fury she saw in the lady's eyes. But her worn servant's shoes, thin-soled things that were more whole than leather, caught on the edge of the ceremonial carpet. She stumbled forward, her body tilting, the tray tilting with her, and though she managed to keep the goblets from falling, she couldn't stop her own momentum from carrying her 2 steps closer to the altar than any servant should ever approach. The crack of the slap seemed to split the very air itself. Lady Marcella moved with the speed and violence of an alpha pushed to the edge of her control, her hand connecting with Livia's face with enough force to snap the Omega's head to the side and send her crashing to the marble floor. The tray clattered away, the goblets rolling across the stone, spilling wine like blood across the white marble. Livia's vision went white with pain, then gray at the edges, and she felt the warm trickle of blood from her split lip and the inside of her cheek where her teeth had cut through flesh. "Filthy Omega trash!" Lady Marcella's voice rang through the hall, high and sharp with righteous fury. "How dare you approach the altar like some common dog? Do you have any idea what you've just interrupted? This is a sacred ceremony, and you stumble about like a drunken fool, nearly spilling wine on the king himself." The accusations weren't entirely accurate. Livia hadn't spilled the wine on anyone, and her stumble had been minor, but accuracy didn't matter in moments like these. What mattered was that a high-born alpha had been embarrassed during what should have been her triumph, and she had found a convenient target for her rage. Livia knew the script, had seen it play out dozens of times with other servants. She was supposed to grovel, to apologize profusely, to accept whatever punishment was deemed appropriate, and to disappear as quickly as possible. But before she could even attempt to push herself up from the floor, before she could force the words of apology through her bleeding mouth, something happened that had never occurred in the recorded history of the Crimson Moon Kingdom. King Augustus moved with the fluid speed of a predator at the hunt, closing the distance to Lady Marcella and gripping her wrist before she could strike again. His face was no longer carefully neutral but carved from rage so pure and cold it seemed to drop the temperature in the hall by 10 degrees. Every wolf in the room felt it, the crushing weight of an alpha king's fury, the kind of dominance that didn't need to be voiced to make grown warriors want to bare their throats in submission. "You dare," the king said, his voice pitched low but carrying to every corner of the vast hall with perfect clarity, "to strike one who bears my mark? You dare to shed the blood of my true mate at what was to be our bonding ceremony." The silence that followed those words was so complete that Livia could hear her own blood dripping onto the marble, each drop sounding like thunder in the shocked stillness. Lady Marcella's face went from red with anger to white with shock, her mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. The high priest dropped his ceremonial staff, the clatter making several guests jump. The council of elders, seated in their place of honor, looked as though they might collectively have a stroke. Because what the king had just declared was impossible. It violated every rule, every tradition, every carefully constructed hierarchy that had governed their society for centuries. Kings did not have fated mates among the servant class. The moon goddess did not pair the highest with the lowest. Such imbalance would threaten the stability of the entire social order. And yet, there stood King Augustus, the most powerful alpha in 7 territories. His hand still gripping his noble bride's wrist to prevent her from striking again. His eyes now fixed on the bleeding Omega on the floor with a possessiveness that could not be faked or denied. Livia tried to speak, to deny it, to somehow defuse this catastrophe before it consumed them all, but her voice wouldn't work. She could only stare up at the king, at this man who was supposed to be utterly beyond her reach, and feel the truth of his words resonating in every fiber of her being. The thing that had stirred inside her, that dormant presence that had whispered "mate" earlier, now roared to life with such force that she gasped audibly. For the first time in her 19 years, Livia felt her wolf, not emerging, not yet, but present and aware and absolutely certain of what stood before them. King Augustus released Lady Marcella's wrist as if it burned him and moved to kneel beside Livia. His large hand surprisingly gentle as he cupped her injured face. His thumb carefully avoiding the split lip but tilting her chin so he could examine the damage. Up close, his eyes were not simply dark brown but flecked with gold, and they studied her with an intensity that made her feel transparent, as if he could see straight through to her soul and was reading everything written there. "I smell it on you," he said softly, though his words still carried through the silent hall. "Honeysuckle and rain and something else, something that makes my wolf claw at my insides demanding I claim you right here, right now before all these witnesses. Tell me I'm not insane. Tell me you feel this too." Livia's mouth went dry. This couldn't be happening. Kings didn't kneel on ceremonial floors for servants. Kings didn't speak to Omegas in voices rough with barely controlled need. Kings didn't have entire wedding halls full of nobility witnessing them reject their chosen brides for lowly wolfless servants who couldn't even perform basic tasks without stumbling. This had to be a fever dream, or she had died when she hit the floor, and this was some elaborate afterlife punishment for having dared to look at the king with longing. But his hand on her face was warm and real, and she could feel the slight tremor in his fingers that spoke of the enormous control he was exerting to remain gentle when everything in him clearly wanted to grab her, mark her, claim her before anyone could take her away. She could feel the heat of him, smell his scent, cedar and steel and thunderstorms, and her traitorous body wanted to lean into his touch, wanted to close the distance between them and damn the consequences. "Your Majesty," she finally managed to whisper, her voice hoarse with pain and shock. "I'm nobody. I'm less than nobody. I'm an Omega servant without even a wolf to call my own. This has to be a mistake." The moon goddess wouldn't, she couldn't. "The moon goddess makes no mistakes," Augustus said, and though his words were simple, they carried the weight of absolute conviction. "I have waited 32 years to feel what I felt the moment you stumbled into this hall. I have attended 100 bonding ceremonies, met 1,000 eligible she-wolves, and felt nothing until you. Do you think I would make this declaration, would throw away political alliances and risk the stability of my kingdom, if I were not absolutely certain?" Lady Marcella had recovered enough to speak, her voice shaking with rage and humiliation. "This is absurd. She's a servant. She's probably using some kind of spell, some Omega trick to ensnare you. Guards, seize her immediately and take her to the dungeons where she can be questioned about what dark magic she's employed." Several of the royal guards shifted uncomfortably, caught between their duty to obey the would-be Luna Queen and their absolute loyalty to their king, who was currently looking at Lady Marcella with something very close to hatred. The tension in the room ratcheted up another impossible degree, and Livia could feel that they were approaching a breaking point where violence might erupt. The high priest Cornelius, who had officiated at royal bonding ceremonies for 40 years and witnessed his share of drama, cleared his throat carefully. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should adjourn to a more private setting to discuss this unexpected development. The ceremonial hall is hardly the appropriate venue for such personal revelations." But one of the Council of Elders, Lord Tiberius, a grizzled alpha with a reputation for rigid traditionalism, stood from his seat, his face purple with indignation. "Private setting. This farce has already played out before 500 witnesses. The damage is done. Your Majesty, with all due respect, You cannot possibly be serious about claiming a lowly Omega as your Luna Queen. The position requires strength, political acumen, the ability to bear strong heirs. Careful, Augustus said, his voice dropping into a register that made every wolf in the room feel their animal instincts scream danger. He stood, pulling Livia up with him, keeping himself positioned between her and everyone else in the hall in a protective stance that was pure alpha instinct. Very careful what you say next about my mate. I have spent the last 10 years listening to your counsel about who I should choose, what alliances I should forge, what bloodlines would most benefit the kingdom. I have been patient. I have been political. But the moon goddess herself has now spoken, and I will not ignore her decree because it inconveniences your carefully laid plans. Lord Tiberius sputtered, looking to his fellow council members for support. But she has no wolf. She has no training. She doesn't even have a proper family name. How can she possibly? She has me, Augustus said, and the finality in his tone made it clear the discussion was over. She has the protection of her king and the recognition of the moon goddess. That is more than enough. High Priest Cornelius, I require you to perform a formal mate bond recognition ceremony immediately. The high priest looked like he wished the floor would open up and swallow him, but he was a man who took his sacred duties seriously. Your Majesty, the mate bond recognition ceremony requires. That is, both parties must have their wolves present to confirm the bond. If the young lady is wolfless, then technically. He was interrupted by a sound that had never before been heard in the ceremonial hall, a low, resonant growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Livia's eyes went wide with shock because the sound was coming from her, or rather, from something inside her that was suddenly and violently awake. Her skin began to glow with a faint silver light, and she felt something rising within her, something ancient and powerful that had been sleeping for far too long. The pain was excruciating. Every bone in her body felt like it was breaking and reforming, every muscle spasming, every nerve ending on fire. She would have collapsed if Augustus hadn't been holding her, his strong arms wrapping around her as she convulsed. But through the pain she felt something else, a presence in her mind that was unmistakably her wolf, finally emerging after 19 years of silence. The voice that spoke in her mind was feminine and fierce and carried an authority that made even the pain seem insignificant. I am Selene, daughter of the moon goddess herself, and I have waited in this vessel for the moment when my true mate would call me forth. Time has come, little one. Let me show them what a true Luna looks like. Livia wanted to ask what that meant, wanted to protest that she had no idea what was happening or how to control any of this, but her body was no longer entirely under her control. The silver light intensified, bright enough that people in the front rows had to shield their eyes. Her hair, which had been a simple auburn, now shimmered with threads of silver and white. Her gray eyes, when she opened them, glowed with an inner light that marked her as something far more than an ordinary Omega. When the transformation was complete and the light finally faded, a collective gasp went through the hall. Because standing where a lowly servant had been was someone different. Not different in body, for Livia's form remained the same, but different in presence. She stood straighter, moved with an unconscious grace, and most importantly, she was wrapped in an aura of power that every wolf in the room could feel pressing against their senses. High Priest Cornelius, who knew more about wolf lore than perhaps anyone living, looked at Livia with something approaching awe. A late bloomer, he breathed. Not just any late bloomer, but a silver wolf. I have only read about such things in the oldest texts. They are said to emerge only once in a generation, only when the moon goddess has a specific purpose for them. They possess powers beyond normal wolves. Healing, prophecy, the ability to sense truth and lies. Lord Tiberius, who had been preparing another protest, snapped his mouth shut and sat down heavily in his chair, looking like his entire worldview had just been turned inside out. Several other council members were whispering urgently to each other, pulling out ancient texts and scrolls from their ceremonial robes, clearly trying to verify what they had just witnessed. Lady Marcella, however, was not ready to concede defeat. Her face had gone from white to red again, and her hands were clenched so tightly that her perfectly manicured nails drew blood from her palms. Silver wolf or not, she is still common-born. She has no house, no family, no connections. She has spent her entire life scrubbing floors. How can she possibly rule beside a king? Augustus turned to face his rejected bride, and there was no kindness in his expression, only cold dismissal. Lady Marcella, I believe our arrangement is concluded. You may return to House Aurelius with my assurances that the dissolution of our engagement carries no dishonor to your family. Indeed, I will provide a generous settlement to compensate for any embarrassment caused by this situation. Marcella's laugh was bitter and sharp. Generous settlement. You think gold and titles can compensate for this humiliation? I was to be Luna Queen. I was to stand beside you and rule 7 territories. And you cast me aside for. She couldn't even finish the sentence, so overcome was she with rage and wounded pride. For my fated mate, Augustus said simply. For the woman the moon goddess herself chose for me. Yes, Lady Marcella, I do exactly that, and I would do it 1,000 times over. Your pride is your own concern. My duty is to my kingdom, and my kingdom needs a Luna chosen by divine will, not political convenience. He turned back to Livia, his expression softening. Can you stand on your own? The transformation must have taken much from you. Livia nodded, though truthfully she felt shaky and disoriented, like she had just woken from a 19-year sleep to find the world completely changed. She was aware of Celine in her mind now, a constant warm presence that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. The wolf kept sending her flashes of emotion, fierce joy, protective rage, overwhelming love directed at the man standing before them, and Livia was struggling to separate her own feelings from her wolf's. I can stand, she said, and was surprised to find her voice stronger than before, carrying an authority that had never been there when she was just a servant. But your majesty, I don't understand any of this. Yesterday I was scrubbing pots in the kitchen. Today I apparently have a wolf who claims to be daughter of the moon goddess. How is any of this possible? Silver wolves are always late bloomers, High Priest Cornelius said, approaching them carefully, his scholarly interest overcoming his shock. They require a catalyst to emerge, usually the presence of their true mate. Your wolf has been dormant all these years because she was waiting for precisely this moment. As for being daughter of the moon goddess, he shook his head in wonder. If that is true, then you are far more than any of us realized. You are divine royalty, which would actually make you the perfect match for a king. Lord Tiberius had recovered enough to rejoin the conversation, though his tone was significantly more respectful than before. Your Majesty, if we proceed with this bonding, there will be complications. House Aurelius will be insulted, and they control 3 of the northern passes. The other noble houses will question the stability of the succession if the Luna Queen comes from no established bloodline. And there is still the matter of the lady's training and preparation. She cannot simply step into the role of Luna Queen without. Then she will be trained, Augustus said, cutting off the objection. We will take whatever time is necessary. As for House Aurelius and the other noble families, they can accept the will of the moon goddess, or they can learn why questioning divine decree is unwise. I am not a king who rules by permission of the nobles, Lord Tiberius. I am a king who unified 7 territories through strength, and will continue to rule through strength. Any house that wishes to contest this decision is welcome to challenge me directly. The threat hung in the air, and no one dared to take him up on it. Augustus was not just powerful politically but physically. He had won his crown in combat, defended it against multiple challengers, and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless with anyone who threatened his kingdom. The noble houses might grumble and scheme, but none of them wanted open conflict with him. Lady Marcella looked around the hall, perhaps hoping for support, for someone to champion her cause, but even her own family members were backing away from her, recognizing a lost cause when they saw one. Her father, Lord Aurelius, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Her mother had tears streaming down her face, Though whether from sympathy for her daughter or anger at the loss of a crown, it was hard to tell. Finally, Marcella drew herself up to her full height, wrapped the tattered remains of her dignity around herself like a cloak, and spoke in a voice that shook but held. "Very well, Your Majesty. I see that I am dismissed. But mark my words. This decision will have consequences that extend far beyond this hall. You may have your divine mate, but you will find that running a kingdom requires more than the moon goddess's blessing. It requires alliances, compromises, and a Luna who understands the political realities of power." She turned to Livia, and her expression was pure venom. "Enjoy your moment, little Omega. The crown you're about to wear is far heavier than you can possibly imagine. When you fail, and you will fail, remember that I warned you." With that, she swept from the hall, her elaborate wedding dress trailing behind her like a wounded bird. Several members of House Aurelius hurried after her, shooting dark looks at Augustus and Livia as they went. The mood in the hall shifted from shocked silence to uncomfortable murmuring as people began processing what they had just witnessed. Augustus turned to High Priest Cornelius. "The mate bond recognition ceremony. I want this formally blessed and recorded before anyone can raise further objections." The high priest looked torn between his duty and his practical concerns. "Your Majesty, perhaps Lady Marcella had a point about allowing time for adjustment. This has been a traumatic day for all involved. Surely waiting a few days to..." "Now," Augustus repeated, his tone brooking no argument, "I will not risk any attempt to separate us before the bond is formally recognized. There are too many who would see political advantage in removing an inconvenient fated mate before the ceremonies could be completed." Livia's blood ran cold as she realized he was right. She had gone from invisible servant to the most dangerous threat to noble power in the kingdom in the space of minutes. There were surely people in this very hall who were already calculating how to eliminate her, how to restore the political order, how to convince the king that he had been mistaken about the mate bond. As if reading her thoughts, Celine's voice spoke in her mind. "Fear not, little one. I will not allow harm to come to us. We are stronger than they know, stronger than even we know yet. But we must trust our mate. He will protect us while we learn to protect ourselves." The high priest sighed heavily but gestured for them to approach the altar once more. Several servants, Omegas like Livia had been, rushed forward to clean up the spilled wine and right the ceremonial items that had been knocked over. They gave Livia wide-eyed stares as they worked, unable to comprehend how one of their own had just become the most important person in the kingdom. The mate bond recognition ceremony was much shorter than a formal bonding ceremony but no less sacred. The high priest called for witnesses to step forward. Reluctantly, several of the council members obliged, though their expressions suggested they were doing so under protest. He then lit special incense that was said to clear the mind and allow truth to be perceived, and began reciting ancient prayers in the old tongue. Augustus took Livia's hand, and even that simple touch sent electricity racing through her body. She could feel him through the bond now, feel the depth of his certainty, his protective instincts, and underneath it all, a lonely ache that suggested he had been waiting for this connection his entire life. It made her heart clench, this glimpse into the inner world of a king who had to project strength at all times, but who had been desperately hoping for someone who could be his true equal. "Do you, Augustus Maximus of the Crimson Moon Kingdom, recognize this woman as your fated mate, chosen by the moon goddess herself?" the high priest intoned. "I do," Augustus said, his eyes never leaving Livia's face. "Before the moon goddess and all these witnesses, I claim Livia as my true mate, my Luna, my equal in all things." "And do you, Livia of..." The high priest paused, realizing she had no house name to speak. "Livia of the Silver Wolf, recognize this man as your fated mate, chosen by the moon goddess herself." Livia's mouth went dry. This was the moment where she could still back away, could claim confusion or coercion, could save herself from a life of impossible responsibility and constant danger. No one would truly blame her. She was just a servant who had been thrust into circumstances beyond her control. She could retreat to safety, to anonymity, to the simple life she had always known. But as she looked into Augustus's eyes, as she felt the bond singing between them, as she heard Celine's encouraging presence in her mind, Livia realized that backing away was not actually an option. Not because she was being forced, but because every instinct in her body was screaming that this man, this moment, this impossible fate was exactly where she was meant to be. The moon goddess had hidden her wolf for 19 years specifically so that she would emerge at this moment, for this purpose. Who was she to question divine will? "I do," she said, and though her voice shook slightly, the words rang clear and true through the hall. "Before the moon goddess and all these witnesses, I recognize Augustus as my true mate, my king, my equal in all things." The high priest smiled for the first time since the chaos had begun, a genuine expression of joy that transformed his ancient face. "Then by the power vested in me by the moon goddess herself, I recognize this bond as true and sacred. May you lead this kingdom together with wisdom, strength, and compassion. May your union be blessed with strong cubs. May you—" He was interrupted by a commotion at the back of the hall. The massive doors burst open with a crash that made everyone jump, and a warrior in the crimson and gold armor of the royal guard stumbled through, his face pale and bleeding from a wound on his temple. "Your Majesty," the warrior gasped, falling to one knee. "The northern border is under attack. A coalition of rogue packs has breached the defensive line. They're claiming—" He paused, looking around the hall at all the assembled nobles, clearly uncertain about speaking freely. "Speak plainly," Augustus commanded, his entire demeanor shifting from mate to king in an instant. "What are they claiming?" "They're claiming that the Crimson Moon Kingdom has fallen into chaos, that you have rejected your noble bride for an Omega servant, and that you are unfit to rule. They're calling for the noble houses to overthrow you and install a new king, one who respects the traditional order." The hall erupted into chaos. Some nobles leaped to their feet, shouting questions about the size of the attacking force. Others began arguing about whether this proved that the disrupted wedding had been a catastrophic mistake. Still others were already edging toward the exits, clearly calculating how to position themselves if a civil war was about to erupt. The carefully maintained peace of the ceremonial gathering dissolved into panic and political maneuvering. Augustus's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek, but his voice when he spoke was cold and controlled. "How many?" "At least 300 rogues, Your Majesty, possibly more. They hit 3 border outposts simultaneously. Commander Lucius is holding the main garrison, but he's requesting immediate reinforcements. He says they have siege equipment and appear to be well organized. This was planned, not some spontaneous raid." Of course it was planned, Livia thought with sudden clarity. This attack was too perfectly timed, coming mere minutes after the chaos of the interrupted wedding. Someone had been waiting for exactly this kind of disruption, ready to exploit any sign of weakness in the kingdom. She looked around the hall at the assembled nobles, wondering which of them had known this was coming, which had perhaps even helped coordinate it. Augustus was clearly thinking the same thing, his eyes scanning the crowd with predatory assessment. "Lord Tiberius, summon the full council to the war room immediately. Lord Cassius, I want every guest in this hall accounted for and confined to the palace grounds until we determine who knew about this attack. Lady Octavia, you will coordinate with the palace guards to establish a full defensive perimeter." The nobles he named jumped to obey, recognizing the tone of a king who would tolerate no hesitation. Augustus turned to the commander of his personal guard, a grizzled warrior named Maximus who had fought beside him for 15 years. "Triple the guard on the Luna Queen. No one gets near her without my explicit permission. If anyone attempts to harm her or remove her from the palace, you have my authorization to use lethal force." Luna Queen. He had called her Luna Queen, not Luna to be or mate to be confirmed, but Luna Queen, as if her position was already absolute and unquestionable. Livia felt the weight of the title settle on her shoulders like a physical thing, heavy and terrifying and strangely right all at once. "Your Majesty, I should come with you," Livia heard herself say, though she had no idea where the words came from, possibly from Celine, who was projecting fierce determination through their bond. If this attack is being justified by our bonding, then the kingdom needs to see us together, unified. If I hide in the palace while you go to war, it will look like I'm ashamed or weak or that you're uncertain about your choice. Every eye in the hall turned to her, some shocked that a newly recognized Luna would dare to speak up, others curious about what the king would do. Augustus looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Livia wondered if she had just committed some terrible breach of protocol, if she was supposed to be demure and silent while the men handled warfare. But then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming it from stern to almost boyish for just a moment. You see, Lord Tiberius, this is what a true Luna looks like. One who thinks strategically even in crisis, who understands that leadership is as much about perception as reality. Livia is correct. We go together. Lord Tiberius looked like he wanted to protest, but ultimately just shook his head in resignation. Your Majesty, the risk. The risk is acceptable, Augustus said firmly. Besides, she has a silver wolf who is apparently daughter of the moon goddess. I suspect she is far safer than any of us realize. Now move. We have a kingdom to defend. The next hours passed in a blur of organized chaos. Livia was rushed to the Luna Queen's chambers, room she had cleaned 100 times but never imagined occupying, where a team of servants descended on her like a swarm of purposeful bees. Her worn servant's dress was stripped away and replaced with armor specially crafted for a Luna Queen, flexible leather reinforced with steel plates, dyed in the crimson and silver that were now apparently her colors. Her hair was braided back in a warrior's style, practical and secure. An elderly Omega named Claudia, who had served the previous Luna Queen, supervised the preparations with quiet efficiency. You'll do fine, child, she said softly as she fastened the last buckle on Livia's armor. I served Luna Helena for 30 years before she passed, and let me tell you, the best Lunas are the ones who never expected to wear the crown. The ambitious ones, the ones raised for power, they think they know everything. But you'll learn. You'll listen. And that makes all the difference. I don't even know how to hold a sword, Livia admitted, staring at the blade being strapped to her hip. I don't know battle tactics or diplomacy or how to command respect from wolves who were born into houses older than the kingdom itself. How am I supposed to? You have a silver wolf and the moon goddess on your side, Claudia interrupted gently. And more importantly, you have a good heart. I've watched you these past years, child. Seen how you treated the other servants with kindness even when you had nothing yourself. Seen how you worked twice as hard as anyone else because you knew your wolfless status made you vulnerable. Those qualities, compassion, resilience, humility, those are what make a true leader, not fancy bloodlines or political connections. Celine rumbled approval in Livia's mind. The old Omega speaks wisdom. Trust in yourself, little one. We were born for this moment, even if we did not know it until now. When Livia emerged from the chambers, she found Augustus waiting in the corridor, now dressed in his battle armor, black and steel etched with silver runes that were said to be blessed by the moon goddess herself. He had a massive broadsword strapped across his back and a look of grim determination on his face. But when he saw her, his expression softened fractionally. You look like a Luna Queen, he said simply, and the way he said it made it clear he meant it as the highest compliment. He offered her his arm in a gesture that was both courtly and practical. Stay close to me during the march. The warriors need to see us as a unit, unshakable and committed. Can you do that? I can try, Livia said honestly, taking his arm and feeling the solid strength of him. I should warn you though, I have no idea what I'm doing. I've never even left the palace grounds before today. He smiled grimly. Then you're about to get quite an education. Our people are waiting. They descended to the main courtyard where 500 warriors had assembled in perfect formation, their armor gleaming in the late afternoon sun. When Augustus and Livia emerged, a ripple went through the ranks, some of shock, some of curiosity, some of skepticism. These were hardened fighters who had bled for their king and kingdom, and they were now being asked to accept a completely unknown Omega as their Luna Queen. Augustus didn't give them time to dwell on their doubts. He strode to the center of the formation, pulling Livia with him, and his voice rang out with a command that had led these warriors through a dozen battles. Soldiers of the Crimson Moon. You've heard the reports. Our borders are under attack by rogues who think we've grown weak, who believe that divine decree is less important than political convenience. They're wrong, and we're going to prove exactly how wrong they are. A cheer went up, but Augustus held up his hand for silence. You see beside me a woman who was a servant this morning and is now your Luna Queen. Some of you are confused by this. Some of you doubt. That's acceptable. I'm not so arrogant as to demand blind faith. But I will tell you this. The moon goddess herself chose this woman for me, marked her with a silver wolf, and declared her worthy. And when the moon goddess speaks, I listen. I suggest you do the same. He turned to Livia, and she felt a moment of panic, unsure what he expected from her. But Selene was there, whispering guidance, and Livia found herself stepping forward even though her knees shook. I know you don't know me, she said, and was relieved when her voice carried clearly across the courtyard. I know I have no battle experience, no noble training, no reason for you to trust me. But I promise you this. I will never ask you to risk anything I'm not willing to risk myself. I will learn everything I need to learn to be worthy of standing beside your king. And I will fight with everything I have to protect this kingdom and everyone in it, because the moon goddess gave me a purpose, and I will not fail her or you. The words felt inadequate, a pale shadow of the speeches great leaders gave, but something in them must have resonated because she saw several warriors exchange glances and nod. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a start, recognition that she at least understood the magnitude of what she had been given. Commander Lucius, a scarred veteran with eyes like chips of ice, stepped forward and executed a perfect salute. Luna Queen, he said formally. The warriors of the Crimson Moon stand ready to serve. It was a test, Livia realized. He was giving her the opportunity to respond appropriately or to fumble and prove she didn't belong. She straightened her spine, channeled every ounce of confidence Selene was projecting, and returned the salute as precisely as she could manage. Commander Lucius, I am honored by your service and trust your leadership. Let's go defend our kingdom. A flicker of approval crossed the commander's weathered face, and when he turned back to the assembled troops, his voice carried new conviction. You heard your Luna Queen. Form up for march. We move in 5 minutes. The journey to the northern border took 3 hours at a forced march pace, and by the end of it, Livia's legs were screaming and her lungs burned. But she refused to show weakness, refused to ask for rest or slower pace, even when she saw some of the warriors glancing at her with barely concealed doubt. Augustus stayed close the entire time, his presence a steady anchor, occasionally murmuring encouragement when no one else could hear. You're doing better than most nobles would, he told her quietly as they crested a hill and saw the garrison fort in the distance, smoke rising from several buildings. Most court-raised wolves would have demanded a horse or a carriage. The warriors notice these things. They respect strength and endurance. I don't feel strong, Livia admitted, though she kept her pace steady. I feel like I'm one stumble away from collapsing and proving everyone right who said I don't belong here. Then don't collapse, Augustus said simply. Decide right now that you're going to make it to that fort on your own feet, with your head high. Your body will follow where your mind leads. It was easier said than done, but Livia gritted her teeth and focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Selene helped, pushing energy through their bond, and gradually the burning in her muscles faded to a manageable ache. By the time they reached the fort, she was still standing tall, and she saw the shift in some of the warriors' expressions from doubt to grudging respect. The garrison was a scene of controlled chaos. Wounded warriors were being tended to in the medical tents, while others reinforced damaged walls and prepared weapons. Commander Marcus, the garrison leader, met them at the gates with a salute that barely concealed his relief. Your Majesty, thank the moon goddess. We've held them off so far, but they're preparing for another assault at nightfall. They have battering rams and siege ladders. This isn't some random pack of rogues. Someone trained them, equipped them, coordinated them. Show me, Augustus commanded, and they were led to the wall where they could see the rogue encampment spread out across the valley below. Even Livia, with no military training, could tell it was an impressive and organized force. Hundreds of wolves moved with purpose, their camp laid out in military precision, their weapons gleaming in the fading light. "Who's leading them?" Augustus asked, scanning the camp with experienced eyes. "We don't know, Your Majesty. Whoever it is keeps himself hidden in the command tent. But he's good, really good. He knows our defensive patterns, knows where we're weak. Every attack has been perfectly positioned to exploit vulnerabilities." Augustus's jaw tightened. Someone fed them our defensive intelligence. We have a traitor, possibly in the palace itself. The implications hung in the air. If someone at court was feeding information to enemies, then the threat wasn't just external but internal. The kingdom was being torn apart from within, and Livia's elevation to Luna Queen had apparently been the catalyst that brought long-simmering resentments to a boiling point. A messenger rushed up to them, breathless and pale. "Your Majesty, the rogues have sent a formal challenge. Their leader wishes to meet with you under flag of truce to discuss terms." "Terms?" Augustus's voice was ice. "They attack my kingdom, kill my soldiers, and now want to discuss terms? He says he'll cease hostilities and withdraw if you agree to annul your mating to the Omega and restore Lady Marcella as your intended Luna Queen. He says the noble houses will support him if you refuse, that the kingdom will descend into civil war over this issue." There it was, confirmation that this wasn't really about border disputes or rogue wolves but about power and tradition and the established order refusing to accept change. Someone, possibly multiple someones, had decided that Augustus's choice of mate was unacceptable enough to justify warfare. Livia felt sick to her stomach. All of this death and destruction because of her. Because a lowly servant had dared to be fated to a king. She thought about stepping back, about offering to leave, to renounce the bond and return to her servants' quarters, if it would stop the bloodshed. But before she could voice the thought, Augustus turned to her with such fierce protectiveness in his eyes that the words died in her throat. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't even think about sacrificing yourself for political convenience. This attack isn't your fault. It's the fault of wolves who value tradition over divine decree, who would rather see the kingdom burn than accept change." "But if my leaving would save lives?" "It wouldn't," he interrupted firmly. "They're not really fighting about you specifically, they're fighting about power and control. If you left, they would just find another excuse to challenge me, another way to destabilize the kingdom. The only way forward is through. We meet their challenge, we defeat them decisively, and we show every potential rebel that divine right is not subject to committee approval." Celine growled agreement in Livia's mind. "Our mate speaks truth. These wolves respect only strength. We must show them strength." Augustus turned back to the messenger. "Tell their leader I accept his terms of truce for the meeting. 1 hour neutral ground between the camps, 3 escorts each. And tell him that if he values his life, he'll come prepared to negotiate his surrender, not mine." The hour passed in tense preparation. Augustus selected Commander Lucius and 2 of his most trusted warriors to accompany them, while Livia insisted on being part of the delegation despite the protests of multiple advisors who thought the Luna Queen should remain safely behind fortified walls. She understood their concern, but she also understood that showing fear or hiding would be interpreted as weakness. And right now, weakness was the one thing they couldn't afford. As the sun set and painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, they walked across the killing ground between the fort and the rogue camp. 6 figures emerged from the enemy side to meet them halfway. 3 large warriors in mismatched armor, flanking 3 others whose faces were hidden by ceremonial masks. When they were close enough to speak without shouting, one of the masked figures stepped forward and removed his covering, and Livia gasped in shock and recognition. It was Lord Quintus, a member of the Council of Elders, a wolf who had sat in the ceremonial hall just hours earlier, who had witnessed their bonding and said nothing about his plans for betrayal and war. Augustus showed no surprise, which meant he had suspected, though his voice when he spoke was colder than winter frost. "Lord Quintus, I should have known. You've been arguing against my policies for years, but I never took you for a traitor. Quintus smiled, completely unrepentant. Traitor. I prefer to think of myself as a traditionalist trying to save the kingdom from your reckless disregard for social order. You've done many great things, Augustus, but this. He gestured dismissively at Livia. This mating is a bridge too far. The nobles will not accept an Omega servant as Luna Queen, and I'm here to give you a chance to correct this mistake before the kingdom tears itself apart. The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes, Livia heard herself say, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut. And neither does King Augustus. If you have a problem with our bonding, your quarrel is with divine will, not with us. Quintus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Divine will. Child, you're a servant who stumbled at an opportune moment and got lucky. The king felt a momentary attraction and convinced himself it was a mate bond. Give it a few months of dealing with court politics and noble alliances, and he'll realize his error. I'm simply accelerating the inevitable. You know nothing about mate bonds, Augustus said, his voice deadly quiet. Nothing about divine decree, and nothing about my resolve. I will not annul my bonding. I will not restore Marcella. And I will not negotiate with rebels who attack my kingdom under false pretenses. So I'll give you one chance, Quintus. Order your forces to stand down, surrender yourself for trial, and I'll show mercy to the wolves you've led astray. Mercy. Quintus's expression hardened. You're in no position to offer mercy, boy. I have 300 warriors at my back, with more arriving from the discontented noble houses every hour. Your garrison can't hold against those numbers, and your reputation won't survive abandoning your border to rush back to the palace to protect your Omega pet. Surrender her now, restore the proper order, and we can all return to our lives. No, Augustus said flatly. Then you condemn your kingdom to civil war. Every noble house that has been sidelined by your consolidation of power, every traditionalist who thinks you've grown too arrogant, every warrior who believes Omega servants should stay in their place, they'll all rally to my banner. You'll win eventually, I imagine, because you're a superior fighter, but how many will die? How many cities will burn? How much of the kingdom you've built will be left standing when the dust settles? Is one Omega really worth all that? The question hung in the air, and Livia felt the weight of it crushing down on her. She thought of all those potential deaths, all that destruction, and couldn't help but wonder if Quintus was right. Was she really worth a civil war? Was their mate bond truly important enough to justify tearing the kingdom apart? But then she felt Augustus's hand find hers, his fingers lacing through her own in a gesture of absolute solidarity. When he spoke, his voice carried not just to Quintus but to every wolf within hearing distance, human and rogue alike. You ask if she's worth it, as if that's even a question worth answering. The moon goddess chose her for me. She gave Livia a silver wolf after 19 years specifically for this moment. Divine will is not subject to popular vote or political convenience. So yes, Quintus, she's worth it. She's worth fighting for, worth defending, worth building a better kingdom for. And any wolf who thinks tradition is more important than divine decree can line up behind you to learn exactly how wrong they are. He released Livia's hand and drew his sword in one smooth motion, the blade catching the last rays of sunlight. I reject your terms. I reject your rebellion. And I reject any claim you have to speak for this kingdom. You have until dawn to surrender. Any wolf still bearing arms against the crown after sunrise will be treated as an enemy and dealt with accordingly. Quintus's face flushed with rage. You arrogant fool. You're throwing away everything for an Omega who can't even. He never finished the sentence. One of his warriors suddenly cried out and pointed at Livia, his eyes wide with terror. The mark. She bears the moon goddess's mark. Livia had no idea what he was talking about until she looked down at her own arm and saw silver light glowing beneath her skin, forming patterns that looked like ancient script. The light grew brighter, spreading across her skin like living tattoos, and she heard Celine's voice speaking not just in her mind but somehow through her, words in a language Livia didn't know but somehow understood perfectly. I am Selene, daughter of the first wolf, blessed by the moon goddess herself. This vessel was chosen before her birth to stand beside the king and lead this kingdom into a new era. Those who oppose this will are opposing divine decree and will face consequences beyond mortal understanding. The voice that came from Livia's mouth was layered. Her own voice mixed with something older, something that resonated with power that made even the rogues take involuntary steps backward. The silver light spread from her skin into the air around her, forming shapes that looked like ghostly wolves running in circles, their forms made of moonlight and magic. Quintus stumbled backward, his face pale. Impossible. Silver wolves are myths. Stories told to pups. Do I look like a myth? Livia, or Selene, or both working together? Asked, and this time the voice was fully her own but carried absolute certainty and authority. I have slept for 19 years waiting for this moment. I have watched from within as this vessel served and suffered and grew strong through adversity. And now I am awake, and I tell you truly, anyone who raises arms against my mate, against my king, against the divine will that brought us together, will answer not just to mortal law but to forces beyond your comprehension. The silver light pulsed once more, and several of the rogue warriors actually fell to their knees, unable to withstand the pressure of her presence. Even Quintus looked shaken, his earlier confidence cracking like thin ice.